the cloud. Okay, excellent. So good afternoon and welcome to the LERA Best Papers Public Sector Edition. I'm your chair, Jen Harmer, from the Center for Industrial Relations and Human Resources at the University of Toronto. We have three excellent speakers today. We have Mark Reiff from the University of California at Davis, Patrice Mareschal from Rutgers, and Bradley Weinberg from Queen's University. So each of our speakers will present for about 12 to 14 minutes, and then we'll have about 5 minutes after each of the presenters, so you can ask them questions about their presentation. So our first presenter will be Mark Reiff, who's going to be talking about his presentation's titled "In Defense of Public Sector Unionization." So over to you, Mark.
Great, thanks, Jen. I appreciate being here. What I'm going to talk about is one of the essays in my new book, which I'll show here, In the Name of Liberty, the argument for universal unionization. The book has 3 essays in it. The first essay it argues that even in a libertarian utopia, unions would arise and eventually become universal throughout society. The second essay is that in a liberal capitalist state, unions would be considered a basic institution given the principles that most liberals accept as governing liberal capitalism, and therefore again would be universal, what anti-union folks call compulsory, the idea being that every employer, with a few exceptions for small employers, would have to be unionized, and it would all be subject to much post-institutional regulation, very similar to what we have today. But we wouldn't have to first have this carnival, political carnival, where unions had to be voted in, an event that's always subject to such misinformation, you rarely get a fair vote. Those are the first 2 essays. The third essay is what I'm going to talk about today, In Defense of Public Sector Unionization. This is, oddly enough, really mostly an issue in the United States. People don't make the distinction between unionization in the public and private sector as commonly and as regularly as they do in the United States. But some of the issues I talk about here are applicable there as well. Now, I've posted a PDF of the entire essay on the conference box. I guess it's not Dropbox, but whatever it is. So it's there for those of you who want to read it, as well as a much shorter outline of my argument in that chapter. So if you want to see that, you're welcome to. And the book, it's published by Cambridge, so it's on the Cambridge course, so most people can access it through their university libraries. If you can't, it's of course very expensive. So just send me an email and I'm happy to send you a PDF copy of the entire book, so you don't have to shell out the big bucks to get it. So that's how you get access to it. Okay, I'm sure I don't have to tell anybody here about the dismal state of unionization in the country. It's worse in the private sector than in the public sector. In the height of unionization in the private sector, it used to be about 1/3. And that's close to what it's been in the public, what it is now in the public sector. So for the last 70, 80, 90 years, and the battle against unionization in the private sector has really been effective. It's really decimated the private sector. And the public sector has not been so decimated. Reasons were because people didn't think it was important, or it wasn't their priority until recently. And so the attacks on it haven't been so great. But that's changed. And it's changed because, I think, of the success of the attacks on the private sector. Now that the private sector is so decimated, the public sector is where the action is. And that continues up to the present time. I think in many ways, the public sector is now where the anti-union folks are focusing their attacks. Okay, so there are a lot of arguments the anti-union folks make against unionization in the public sector. I'll first just sort of give a one-sentence summary of each of them, and then I'm only going to be able to talk about one of them, I think, given the time we have. Okay, so here are the arguments to make. The first argument, of course, is that the public sector is different than the private sector. And the reasons why we might support unionization in the private sector, even if we do, of course, the right doesn't think we should do that either. But they say even if there are such reasons, they simply don't apply in the public sector. And then we have a whole series of arguments that are designed to show that suppression rather than support of unionization in the public sector is more consistent with the principles of small government on which liberty supposedly depends. And the argument is that government is already too big and getting bigger and bigger, and limiting unionization is an important way to counteract this trend. We also have the argument that public employees provide essential services that cannot be put at risk by strike or otherwise used to extort excessive salaries and benefits out of the government, and therefore suppression of public unions is essential for the common good and the protection of our lives, liberty, and property. And even if not excessive, the salaries and benefits paid to unionized public employees are greater than they would be if public employees were not unionized. And this is one of the few claims that I think is actually true, right? That yes, union employees do better than non-unionized employees. But the claim is, but that's not good for the public, because really these people work for you and me, the taxpayer. And so if they get more money, the taxpayer has to pay for this. And that's simply not good for people. They have to give up more of their property and devote more of their working hours to paying for these things, and that's bad. Public sector unions are also accused of preventing states and localities from dealing quickly and effectively with rising fiscal constraints, and making it impossible, or at least unreasonably difficult, for these entities to make necessary adjustments to the way public services are delivered. Indeed, the anti-union theorists claim that unionization in the public sector undermines the very existence of democracy by tying the hands of public officials to long-term contracts and giving public employees undue influence in the electoral process. And in any event, regardless of whether unionization of the public sector may be good for public employees, it's bankrupting the rest of us through the overly generous pension plans that unions have negotiated. And it's therefore making state and local government financially unsustainable. And this is a threat to whatever aspects of liberty that government is supposed to sustain. And finally, and I'm not going to talk about this at all today, though it's very important, and I don't want to diminish the importance of this. There's the argument that recently prevailed in the Supreme Court in the Janus case, that it's hard for me to stop smiling even when I describe it, because it's so ludicrous. But the argument that prevailed was that requiring non-union members to pay agency fees, which are the fees for services unions supply even to non-members. So the argument was that requiring non-members to pay these agency fees is a form of compelled speech and therefore unconstitutional. And the Supreme Court, in an absolutely startlingly opinion, prevailed there. And that's had the effect, of course, of making all states right to work states as far as the public sector goes. And I talk a lot about that decision in the book, but I won't say anything about that here. All I'm going to talk about here, I think, in the 11 minutes or so I have, oh no, less than that, right? I have about 5 or 6 minutes. All I'm going to be able to talk about here is some of the small government arguments. And so the argument goes something like this. Like all organizations and associations, private sector unions and private sector unions too, all organizations want to get bigger, richer, and have more power, and that's true for public unions too. Not too controversial claim. And to do this, they need more members. And so if there are public sector unions, they're going to be constantly pushing to get more members. And the best way to get more members is to get more public sector employees. Seems to ignore the fact that you could also organize more of the public sector. But the claim is that public sector unions naturally want to get bigger. They want more employees, and therefore they want to make government bigger. And the bigger government does, the more it gets, the more it does, the more intrusive it is into our lives, and the less sphere of action for us individually, and so our liberty is reduced. Okay, so that's the argument. So is it true? First of all, the idea that government is getting bigger, much less exponentially, mind-blowingly bigger, which is what the small government folks contend, is just false. It's just not true. The same number of people worked for the federal government in September 2013 as worked for the federal government in 1966 when Lyndon Johnson was president. And this is not adjusting for the size of the population, which is 50% bigger. Now, the federal government employs exactly 2% of the people with jobs in this country. In 1966, when the numbers were the same, the percentage was, I think it's 4.3%. So it's less than half now, even though the actual number of heads is the same. If we go back to 1939, it's 3%, still significantly bigger than it is now. And I couldn't find figures actually going back far enough to find a time when it was a similar percentage of people employed by the federal government. I mean, I'm sure at some point there was, because the federal government did almost nothing. So the claim that government is exponentially big is just nonsense. When we turn to state and local government, we do find that public employment has not shrunk as much, but still the claim that it has grown widely is overblown. Current employees in state government is now what it was in 1993, and only 30% more than it was in 1977, despite a 47% increase in the population. And local government's much the same. It's increased more than state employment, but it's only increased about 5% more than the population has increased over this entire 40-year period, despite our ever-increasing expectations on what local government is supposed to do. Indeed, the most recent statistics put state and local government together as of in 2018, like federal employment, to be about what it was in 1967. So the whole claim is just completely unsupported by the evidence. Let's see, don't have much behind it though. Even if this were true though, then we have to show that public sector unionization had some effect on the size of government. And this claim goes back a long time. It started out as a claim about economic liberty, the idea that if we had more active local government, there would be less room for private exchange, and this somehow limited our economic liberty. Over time, that morphed into a claim about political liberty, but that's relatively recent here. And there's lots to say about this. First, it's really odd, I think, to consider So the small government people want less regulation, but their solution to this is to regulate the market in terms of producing public sector unions. So the whole driving force of the small government argument is let government stay out of affairs. But as I argue in the first essay of my book, if we stay out of everybody's affairs, the free market would produce almost universal unionization. So there's a big conceptual problem there. The other is why public sector unionization should matter. I mean, if it's true, and it probably is true in a lot of that all organizations want to get bigger and more powerful and richer. Well, that's true of federal, state, and local institutions, public institutions as well, whether or not they're unionized. They don't need public sector unions to drive that. So there's no reason to believe that even if we were to get public sector unions, that that this would have effect on the size of government. Right, so I should probably stop there, given the fast expiring time. So I do hope people take a look at the essay or my outline on there, and it'll detail all my other claims as well. Okay, I'll stop there. Thanks.
Wonderful, thank you. Excellent. Do we have any questions for Mark from the group? Maybe I'll start with a question for you, if it's all right, Mark, while everyone's pondering their ideas. I was wondering, as you're speaking, is the public sector able to compete for good workers when you have wage caps and you have political constraints on their activities? When we put all of these layers on of restraints, is it affecting the ability to get good workers and attract them into the public sector?
Well, I think the biggest hindrance to attracting workers is that they're not paid enough given what they do. That's not really so much caps, but that also ties in with this idea that public sector workers are paid way beyond what their private sector counterparts are. I mean, again, that's just false. If you include, even if you include benefits as well as salaries, public sector workers make a little bit less than their private sector counterparts. And of course, their private sector counterparts are notoriously underpaid. So the idea that that somehow public sector unions are making it more difficult to attract employees, I think it's just not true. If anything, they make it more attractive. I think Patrice and I were talking just before we started recording. One of the very attractive things about, for example, working for Rutgers is that it has a very active union of its faculty. That's unlike a lot of other places, and that makes it a place you might want to work over someplace else, even where all the other benefits and everything were equal.
Great, thank you. Okay, last call for questions. Patrice, yeah, please.
Sure. So I found it interesting, your data that you had on both the number and the size, the percentage of the population that's employed by the federal government. And I think this also kind of fits with some of the small government arguments, is that the percentage has shrunk, but it also seems like there's been a lot more contracting out to private providers for government services, and then that sort of becomes the shadow government. Often unless it's the low end, like janitorial services, groundskeeping, that sort of stuff, those generally tend to be higher paid and spend money in ways that government employees would not be able to spend money. So I'm curious if you have considered that at all in your work. And also typically the small government arguments don't necessarily want to get rid of all of the services. A lot of them would like to see more of the private contracting to get the work done and less permanent employees in federal government and in state and local.
Right, great question. Yes, and of course, not only public agencies are doing this, private companies are doing this too. And one of the main impetuses for this, I think, is to avoid unionization, right? Outsourcing is very common in private companies that are unionized because it's a way of avoiding having to pay union rates. And same thing is true in the public sector. It's a way of keeping the number of unionized public sector employees down. It's a way of avoiding all the various regulations that would apply to public sector employees, regulations which we as a society have decided are a good idea. So why they're not a good idea when they're applying to outsource jobs is not clear. So yes, this is a way, I think, of avoiding unionization and other regulations on how we think people should behave and how employers should behave, and of transferring wealth from the public purse to the private purse, right? I mean, the argument is that the private sector can do it with the same job at less cost. And first of all, it's often false. But second, for the reason it's doing it at less cost is because it's exploiting its workers, because it's committing violations of all kinds of regulations that would make the provision of services more expensive. Same reason why private companies export jobs overseas. It's not because labor is cheaper over there. It's because the entire environment and costs are cheaper over there because they don't have to comply with regulations that we as a society have decided should apply to the production of these goods and services. So yeah, so that's a very important factor. And it's why we need to stop these practices. There's one of the arguments I make against this, which I didn't get time to talk about, is that some public services are inherently governmental. And so here's an example. It's meant to be a fanciful example, but if, for example, to get on an airplane, you need a body cavity search, right? I don't want an employee of Amazon or some other private company performing that, right? That kind of intrusive thing should only be done by government employees, just like determining guilt or innocence shouldn't be done by private companies. Police services shouldn't be done by private companies. There are a lot of examples of this kind of thing where essentially governmental power is handed over to private companies, and why that isn't an even more frightening threat to liberty than having these things done by public companies, I don't know. But that is, of course, one of the techniques the small government folks use to supposedly make government smaller and increase our liberty, but it doesn't really do that. It just threatens it. Does that answer the question?
Great. Great. Thanks, Mark. Maybe you could hold up your book one more time so we could see it.
Right. And
In the name of liberty.
In the name of liberty, yes. Right way around there. Let me just say one thing. One of the things I'm struck about is how, we're all sort of dazed and confused by the world now, and how, we're just being battered on every side. And this kind of gives us a mentality of a defensive position that we're trying to defend everything. And I think that's bad for us. Of course, we do need to defend stuff, but we also need to take a more proactive, positive, even aggressive stance in arguing for the things that we believe. And my book gives us one quiver one arrow in a quiver of the tools that we can use to argue unions should be expanded and regulation should be expanded to permit them, not just defended. And so I hope people will pick that up and take a look at the weapons I've provided in here and see that that's one way of expanding our position instead of just defending.
Wonderful, wonderful resource. Thank you. Thanks, Mark.
Thanks.
Okay, so our second presenter is Patrice Mareschal, who's going to be talking about her work with Jeffrey Keefe, Socioeconomic Status, Crime Rates, Population, or Something Else, Police Staffing and Compensation in New Jersey.
And I do want to share. So is that working? Can you see it?
Yep, looks great.
Okay, great. Okay, so good afternoon. We examine the factors that influence police staffing and compensation in New Jersey. And when we're talking about police staffing, the challenge is often portrayed as a leaky bucket. It's not enough new recruits coming in, too many leaving the profession, and the size of the bucket is growing. And all of these conditions were made worse during the pandemic. During the pandemic, there were budget cuts. Municipalities made both across the board and targeted cuts to policing and other public services. For the police, the working conditions also changed. They spent more time responding to high risk and vulnerable populations. And in many jurisdictions, they switched to 12-hour shifts to reduce contact between officers and possible spread of COVID. And then their duties were expanded to enforce COVID restrictions. There were also multiple high-profile cases of excessive use of force, and this was followed by public protests and calls to defund the police. So, staffing and compensation are particularly important in the current context as municipalities move to restore or increase police funding with the CARES Act and the American Rescue Plan. And at the same time, they face ongoing staffing shortages and difficulty recruiting. So given these two conditions, we focus on two areas. First, we examine the factors that influence sworn police employment in New Jersey municipalities and cities. And we analyze the competitiveness of police salaries in New Jersey compared to similarly situated workers in the state. So, police strength is a term that refers to police presence in jurisdiction, and this can be measured as the number of sworn officers, police expenditures, and the ratio of officers to 1,000 citizens. Previous research has identified a variety of factors that influence police staffing, and these include socioeconomic indicators, racial and ethnic composition, jurisdiction size, and crime rates. With respect to compensation, previous research shows that differences in police pay are related to a variety of factors. This includes the income and economic activity in the jurisdiction, crime rates, proximity to major metropolitan and urban areas, and collective bargaining. Diversity is also a key concern. Historically, police departments in the US have been staffed primarily by white male officers, and racial and ethnic disparities between police and the community have been a concern since the civil rights era. It's been a long-running goal of law enforcement initiatives to recruit more minorities and women to the force. And despite modest gains for female, Black, and Hispanic officers from 1997 to 2016, 71% of full-time sworn officers in local departments are still white, and 90% of chiefs in local departments are white. As a result, agencies do not adequately represent the communities they serve. Also, previous research has shown that more female officers in departments are associated with higher rates of voluntary separations and involuntary dismissals, and more Black and Hispanic officers in departments are associated with higher rates of dismissals. So for our data, we combine data from multiple sources to construct a database that allows us to analyze police staffing and compensation. We start with the Law Enforcement Management and Administrative Statistics, LEMAS data. This is the most comprehensive. And there are 104 police agency observations for New Jersey. 98 are local, municipal, and city police departments, and that's the focus of our study. We also use CPS data for wage estimates, and the American Community Survey for racial and ethnic percentages by community, FBI data for crime by community, and census data for per capita income by community. The methods we use are correlation analysis and OLS regression. For correlation, for staffing, we use the number of sworn officers, and we examine a variety of community indicators listed here. For the OLS regression with the LEMAS data, we run 3 models. In model 1, the dependent variable is the natural log of sworn officers. In models 2 and 3, the dependent variable is the number of sworn officers. And we break out the overall crime rate. So violent crime is considered in model 2, and property crime is considered in model 3. The independent variables, again, are these that are above the community indicators. And for the ASEC data, our dependent variable is the natural log of wages. And for the independent variables, we use a variety of factors listed here that are known to influence wages. Okay, so for our results, we found a positive and statistically significant correlation between the number of sworn officers and community income, population, population squared, budget, violent and property crime, department diversity, and community diversity. For the LEMAS regression results for model 1, the statistically significant variables were middle income, population size, population squared, crime rate, and community diversity. And in particular, we found that middle income communities are more likely to hire sworn officers than either low or high income communities. We found that as population grows, the number of sworn officers increases at a decreasing rate. And in terms of community diversity, we found that a 1 percentile increase in the Black population increases the number of sworn officers by 1.9%, and a 1 percentile increase in the Hispanic population increases the number of sworn officers by 1.5%. For models 2 and 3, we found that both types of crime have a positive and statistically significant effect on police employment, and moreover, that violent crime increases the number of sworn officers 4-fold over property crime. For the wage data, we found that New Jersey police earn a 22% wage premium, and police supervisors earn a 37% premium over all similarly situated workers. discussion. So here we lay out what our hypotheses were that we started with. Given the time constraints, I don't want to spend a lot of time on these because I already noted this in the previous slide. I do want to talk a little bit more about compensation. So we controlled for all factors that were known to impact compensation and for which we had data available, and found that police in New Jersey earn a premium. What's interesting is that typically police have only a high school education in the state, but this is changing in New Jersey with efforts to professionalize the police. The state police do have accreditation training. They weren't part of our study, but less is known about the education requirements at the local level. We also found that New Jersey police do well in terms of pay in the suburbs, but less so in urban areas where the working conditions are more difficult and dangerous, where recruitment, retention, and turnover are areas of concern. And it's not clear that the compensation premium here is sufficient to overcome the challenges that urban areas face. For limitations in future research, we rely on the LEMIS data as the most comprehensive data set available for policing. However, this data set has its drawbacks because it oversamples large departments and undersamples smaller departments. And this makes it difficult to generalize in a state like New Jersey, where government is highly fragmented and there are many small jurisdictions. In addition, the most recent LEMIS data is from 2016. And a lot has happened since then, particularly with the pandemic, that we think would impact both staffing and compensation. And so again, as the funding to local governments is being restored, it's especially important to understand how staffing and compensation are affected. We think that use of force may have a relationship to staffing and compensation. And New Jersey does have requirements for tracking, but there's no statewide collection or analysis of data. The state officials provide very little oversight of the tracking system, and the local departments do not follow any standard set of procedures. So we think this is an area for future research to get this data on use of force and also the data on education standards for the municipal and city police officers. And that wraps it up. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrice. That was a very interesting presentation. Do we have any questions?
I'm going to stop sharing.
Oh, we do have a question from Mark.
I think you're muted.
My apologies. Thanks, Patrice. It was very interesting. If I read one of your slides right, when you're for community diversity, you consider women as one of the diverse factors, and I was sort of surprised by that. Did you find large variations in the number of women in jurisdictions, and are there any conclusions we can draw from that? Did I misread your slide?
Yeah, so the we considered women in terms of department diversity. We also did consider it in terms of community diversity, and it was statistically significant in the correlation analysis, but it was not statistically significant in the regression analysis.
Okay.
And so that's an area for concern. And in particular, New Jersey tends to be a very diverse state. It has a population that's 52% white, but its police force is 70% white. And women are underrepresented on the police forces in New Jersey as well. But they make up about 51% of our population.
Great, thanks.
Thank you. Morley has a question.
Yes, you referred to very large wage premiums for the police there. And as you know, and as you've alluded to, it's very difficult to control for all the factors that can influence those premiums there, danger, hazards, etc. As an alternative to those measures, or as a complement to them, are you ever able to get data on the number of applicants for a job opening? That always strikes me as an alternative measure of whether there's a wage premium. In other words, if they're let these people evaluate the dangers, the hazards, the non-wage conditions, etc., and vote with their feet by applying for jobs or not, one would expect if there are those huge wage premiums, there'd be a larger number of applicants relative to other situations where there aren't those premiums. Are you ever able to get that data?
We don't currently have that data. So that would be another, and I appreciate that suggestion, that would be another area to request from the local departments, and that would probably require Oprah requests to every local department in the state. So we're trying to, and we understand our results here are tentative. We don't really have a good explanation for why this premium looks so large in New Jersey. And so that's what we're kind of casting around with some of the education requirements and the use of force, but looking at the number of applicants, I think would also be very helpful. And we just don't have that data yet.
Some good suggestions there. Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you, Patrice. I think we'll keep motoring along, but really appreciate that presentation. Thank you. Okay, so our final presenter, and luckily we go into a break as well. So we do have a bit of wiggle room with the time if you need a little bit more time, Brad. So Bradley Weinberg is going to present on collective bargaining in the public sector of Canada in light of the constitutional right to strike, legislative changes, and their impact on conflict and wages. Over to you.
All right. Thank you, Jen. Let me preface a little bit that the title of my presentation is a slight misnomer in the sense that I generally use the conferences as a way to push my my research forward, and I've learned, and generally that has served me well in the past, but in the age of COVID might not be the best approach to take. I have 2 young children, and since Easter, I've had to deal with a norovirus outbreak in my house, a COVID outbreak in my house, and my daycare provider having a COVID outbreak. So I've had very little daycare since Easter. So it's not as far along as I'd like this research to be, but I'm basically gonna, the title indicates where I hope to end up. I'll show you why I'm kind of going that way and give a little bit of some preliminary estimates at the end, but also the research went in a little bit of a different direction than I thought from the beginning. So that's also a reason which I'll dive into, obviously. So basically what I'm drawing on here is the different manners in which governments historically in Canada have regulated dispute resolution in the public sector. It's basically been classified into a number of different regimes or models or types. It's kind of been quite in-depth explained in the Bernie et al. Book, Strikes and Essential Services in Canada, that was published in 2001. There's been research prior to that, which I'll get into, but it's kind of a seminal book in this vein of literature. And so basically they elaborate on these 3 different types of dispute resolution. So there's the compulsory arbitration model, or sometimes referred to as the no strike model, in which, as it sounds, no members of the bargaining unit are able to go out on strike, right? And it's the strike weapon is substituted with arbitration, right? You often find this in public sector workers, bargaining units that deal with, public health and safety, right? So police, fire, etc. Next, we have the essential service designation model, or the controlled strike model. And so under this model, right, a certain percentage of the bargaining unit is restricted from going out on strike. And so that's meant to maintain the provision of essential services. And then finally, you have the unfettered strike or right to strike model, which is what you find in the private sector. Some public sector workers also have fall under the unfettered right to strike model, in which there's no restriction on the number of bargaining unit members who can go out on strike. So you can think of this somewhat of as a continuum too, right? So in the no strike model, 0% of the bargaining unit can go out on strike. Under the unfettered right to strike, then 100% can go out, and the essential service designation, there's some percentage in between 0 and 100 that has to stay on the job and maintains the provision of essential services. And so there has been research looking at the effect of these different types or models and how they have impacted the incidence of conflict, the duration of conflict, the costs of conflict. And so Curry and McConnell in 1991, they basically looked at how these different dispute models associated with those outcomes I just mentioned for the period 1964 to 1987. So when a lot of public sector workers were obtaining the right to strike. And basically they found that compulsory arbitration as compared to an unfettered right to strike associated with increased conflict and also increased wages for their time period. Although it was somewhat, they also said it was somewhat of a trade-off. There was more conflict in terms of measuring it in terms of arbitrations. So under compulsory arbitration legislation, there was more arbitrations than there was strikes under an unfettered right to strike model, but arbitrations cost much less than strikes if we're to think about dispute costs. And so they talked about it as a trade-off, in that there was higher wage costs, but lower dispute costs under compulsory arbitration as opposed to right to strike model. And they also found, as I said, the contract wages were higher under compulsory arbitration. And so they basically, said there was a wage premium associated with restricting going out on strike. One of the audience members here and some co-authors, so Morley and some co-authors, re-examined Curry and McConnell's classification of a number of different occupational groups that they used to analyze this, and basically found that while there was some occupational groups that could be classified differently, they largely corroborated the findings of Curry and McConnell when they redid their analyses. Then Mike Campbelletti, Bob Hebden, and Ben Dacus kind of updated this to a more recent period. So they basically ran a very similar type of analysis as Curry and McConnell, but for the period 1978 to 2008, which included a lot of public sector wage restraint in the early 1990s. Essentially, they found that when it came to the incidence and duration of conflict, it corroborated Curry and McConnell's findings from the earlier period. They did find initially that there was no wage premium, but once they controlled for kind of the period of wage restraint, that wage premium associated with compulsory arbitration showed back up. What they did find that differed somewhat from the earlier studies was that the essential service model associated with a decrease in contract wages for their period of analysis. So I'm building on this vein of research somewhat because in 2015, the Supreme Court of Canada handed down their decisions to Saskatchewan Federation of Labor versus Saskatchewan. And so in the Canadian Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms, which forms part of the Canadian Constitution, there's a number of freedoms enumerated, some constitutional rights, one of which is the freedom of association. And so in prior decisions in the 1980s, the Supreme Court of Canada decided that the right to strike was not protected by the Charter, but this decision reversed that. So this decision recognized that there is a limited right to strike protected under the Canadian Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms. And so this was based on the Saskatchewan Federation of Labor brought the suit to the Supreme Court of Canada based on against the government of Saskatchewan because they had an essential service legislation that basically stacked the deck against labor. And so the Supreme Court of Canada found that this infringed on their right to meaningful collective bargaining by restricting their right to strike. And so since this decision, Saskatchewan, being the subject of the decision, had to change its legislation, but a number of other jurisdictions governing a number of jurisdictions have made legislative changes governing public sector dispute resolution since then. None more obvious than Alberta had basically, which had the no strike model in all of its public sector for decades, implemented a piece of legislation called an act to implement a Supreme Court decision regarding legislation on essential services. And so if you recall from my previous slide, the most recent research used a period of analysis up to 2008. And so there's been no examination of the impact of this decision and the changes that it has produced. And so that's why I was initially seeking to extend that previous research and see if I can see, what, if any, impact I can find of there being a constitutional right to strike, and in how, strikes are governed in Canada, and the effect that this then has on conflict and its costs. The other reason I want to look at this is because there's a concern about endogeneity in the prior research, and that governments may have, if they were aware of the effect of the legislation on conflict, on wages, then they could choose to enact certain types of legislation to restrict strikes to produce the outcomes that they want. Right. But, perhaps the Supreme Court decision here represents an exogenous factor that forced those governments to then make changes. And so perhaps, the estimates that can be produced on this kind of more recent period could perhaps be less afflicted by endogeneity bias. So basically the data I'm using here, I'm doing legislative analysis seeking to properly classify 17 public sector occupational groups by their dispute resolution type and model in 11 jurisdictions in Canada. So the 10 provinces plus the federal jurisdiction, right? So this is the same number of jurisdictions and the same number of public sector occupational groups as was used in the Campoletti et al. Piece. And why I ended up going in a bit of a different route here is because in order to properly classify and to build on them, I had to kind of go into their classification to make sure that I had the occupational groups, classified in the way that they had them. And basically I found some discrepancies in the way in which they had classified. So I'm taking the Morley Gunderson approach here to the Curry and McConnell piece. I'm basically here and in this presentation, but also in the larger research, going back and reclassifying all of the Campoletti et al. Classifications, because I essentially found about 50 discrepancies in kind of the occupational group jurisdiction cells. So that's like 50 out of about 180 something, 188 or around there, 187. And so that demands, I think, a reanalysis of their findings as well. And so I'm using data from the Workplace Information and Research Division of the Labor Program within Employment and Social Development Canada. So this includes major wage settlements database for the period 1978 to 2019. It's over 19,000 collective bargaining agreements. Obviously, my sample will get whittled down once I focus in on the public sector and occupational groups within the public sector and so forth. But there's a whole host of information just beyond the wage settlement too. There's the manner in which the contract was settled, the size of the bargaining unit, the union, the duration of the agreement, the duration of the negotiation. There's a whole host of information in there. And I'm also merging it with the major strikes database for the same time period, which has over 1,300 work stoppages, has, again, the number of workers that gone out, so the number of person days lost, the duration, a whole host of information. And there's benefits to merging these two because it acts as a robustness check in some ways to make sure that those in the wage settlement, the contract database, that I'm properly identifying where the conflict is taking place because I can see, that a strike took place. So the empirical strategies that I adopt in this is basically the same as, those other previous papers that I mentioned. And so basically doing 3 different types of analyses, a model of dispute resolution on the incidence of conflict, employing a multinomial logit. I'll then look at how these different types of dispute resolution legislation, affect or correlate with the duration of conflict using eventually a Cox proportional hazards model. And then looking at its effect on wage settlements using time series cross-sectional analysis. So in today's presentation, I will only get to number 1. Again, I got held up a little bit, and so it's not where I would like to be, but I'll also produce some summary statistics that I think give me some idea about at least number 3 and how that's going to play out. And so again, my thought was to build on those previous papers to try and look at, the most recent period and that Supreme Court decision and its effect on legislation, and then that's effect on the different industrial relations outcomes. But again, with finding those discrepancies, I feel that demands a reanalysis of the prior period. So eventually I'll look at 1978 to 2008, being that prior period that was analyzed, see how my estimates differ from those prior papers. I'll do the entire period to extending it to 2019, and then look at 2009 to 2019, that most recent decade, to try and see if I can, hopefully maybe identify the impact of the Supreme Court decision, the Saskatchewan decision. So here's some summary statistics that I've produced, and I've got, so again, I'm going to reanalyze the Campoletti et al. Paper, and so I've included their summary statistics as well as my summary statistics here. And so as you can see, I only differ. So I rebuilt this data set myself, knowing based on some conversations with the authors here and knowing, what they were kind of doing a little bit, but I'm only about 50 contracts off of what they did. But you can see my reclassification has shifted quite a bit of the totals in terms of, so up here we have the different types of dispute resolution, and then we have the different contract outcomes and the mean real wage. If you'll recall, one of the findings that kind of proliferates throughout the previous literature is that there's a wage premium associated with compulsory arbitration, right? And now obviously these are just summary statistics. I'm not, this isn't regression analysis. I'm not controlling for other factors, but right, when you look at Campoletti et al. Summary statistics, right, the mean real wage and for contracts settled under a compulsory arbitration is higher than, right, the contract settled under a right to strike. So, that does point to perhaps, there is a wage premium there. But in my reclassification, that switches, right, and quite a bit. So I'm of the mindset that when I do get around to doing number 3 in my empirical strategy there, that that wage premium associated with compulsory arbitration actually might disappear. In terms of, I'll go on now to, this was number 1. So now these are the multinomial logit estimates. So basically this is looking at, and these are marginal effects. This is basically looking at how the different legal structures, so right to strike being the base, how they compare, how they associate with the different manners in which a contract can be settled. So in a strike, legislated, arbitrated, settled in mediation or conciliation, or directly bargained. And again, here, these estimates at the kind of the top pane are the Campoletti et al. Estimates, whereas these are my estimates down here on the second pane. And you can see that, in terms of some contract outcomes, they're quite similar. So if you look at arbitration, really, compulsory arbitration associates with a highly significant increase in the likelihood that, in the probability that a contract will be settled in arbitration. I have a similar finding. The other two are kind of insignificant. I think the biggest difference I'd like to highlight here is right. There's the whole notion in terms of arbitration and the practice of arbitration, that there is a chilling effect, that there's a narcotic effect, right? And this kind of bears out a little bit in the Campoletti et al. Findings, in that they find that if there's compulsory arbitration legislation, there's a much higher likelihood of an arbitrated agreement, and there's a much lesser likelihood that a contract will be freely settled, will be bargained directly between the parties, right? But my estimates actually don't bear that out really. Basically, there's an insignificant difference between in compulsory arbitration versus right to strike legislation in terms of whether the agreement is directly negotiated. The other two, so choice of procedure or essential service, they associate with a higher likelihood of a directly bargained agreement. But I think the more interesting finding is regarding the compulsory arbitration legislation. These are hot off the press right here, so I haven't actually had the entire time to digest. So, but I'm happy to kind of keep this up now. If anyone has any questions, I feel like if Morley's still on the call, he must be burning with constructive criticism.
He's just looking for his raise hand button. We found it. This is exciting. This is a good, I'm excited about this. Okay, Morley, over to you.
So a friendly suggestion, and that is, given you've detected what you interpret as a misclassification on their part, and that makes sense to do a new thing with your classification and leave it to the readers as to what's best. But a suggestion is, and maybe you've already done this, I think you want to replicate exactly what they did with their so-called misclassification, so that when you're comparing your results to theirs, it's based on your different classification, not on some other thing. As you know, it's extremely difficult to replicate the results of anyone else's study.
I would love to replicate the results, Morley, and I have sunk a fair amount of effort into trying to, but there are some reasons why. These I guess the estimates that were produced by my predecessors were lost to computer malfunctions, and so I've tried to get as much from the previous authors as I can. My initial intention was to recreate what they've done, and then it's been very difficult to do that, which is why I've just fallen into reporting what their estimates are and then what mine are. But I completely agree with you, and I actually put in a really strong effort to try, and it just part maybe why I'm also not where I need to be with this research and for this presentation. But yeah, no, I agree with you, and I wish I was able to.
Okay, makes sense.
All right, we've got a question from Mark here.
Right, thanks, Bradley. It's really interesting, and so I appreciate what you're trying to do is critique this prior study. So my question really may not be relevant to what you're doing, but my worry is that some of the factors are either expressions of let's call it corporate culture, or well, let's go with that, expressions of a corporate culture that have similar effects on all the things that arbitration does. So, for example, if a employer is establishes a corporate culture, has a corporate culture where arbitration is the go-to, then maybe that means they're less conflict-oriented to begin with, and that therefore the arbitration wage premium is the result of having a corporate culture where the employer is less aggressive, not that arbitration causes the wage premium. So I wonder if that's a consideration that concerns you at all, or if you can think of any way to measure that. Be hard to measure.
So yeah, thanks, Mark. So these are all public sector employers. You know, I don't know how I would get at the corporate culture, but I think, you know, a lot of these public, you know, I don't have my controls listed here, which I maybe should have gone through, but I do have a whole host of controls here. One of which is the political party in power. So in Canada, right, there's more than two parties. We have multiple parties, but you can also have majority governments, minority governments, which impact, you know, what those political parties are able to do. And so I do have controls. Well, and even those are actually, you know, variables of interest too. I didn't report them here, but the Campoletti et al., they find very actually kind of surprisingly little impact of political party in power, which again, mine end up differing in a fair amount, and especially for something in terms of like how here in this chart and in these results, you know, having a contract settlement legislated is a political act. And so, you know, I find that it actually, you know, the political party in power makes a big difference for whether or not an agreement is legislated or not. In terms of your question, though, about wages, yeah, I mean, I don't think I could get at corporate culture per se. The other thing I'll say is, I mean, I'm not there yet, and I'm on one of my empirical strategy of 3, and 3 is my wage analysis. And you know, like I said, I think I have a hunch of how that's going to go based on the summary statistics, but I haven't done that analysis yet. But I do find, I mean, part of the wage premium associated with compulsory arbitration that always, I guess, makes me question that a little bit is that, I mean, arbitration in and of itself is a conservative process, and arbitrators tend to be conservative in their decision making. And so to find that there's a wage premium associated with arbitration also has always struck me as kind of odd. But again, it's proliferated through this vein of research that, you know, there is a wage premium associated with it. So I hope I don't think I could fully answer your question, but I hope I kind of scratched the surface there a little bit.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Well, that was great. Thank you very much, Bradley. That was thrilling to watch a new fresh look at some research that's been done, and to also hear from Morley as well too on that too. So thanks very much, Bradley. And thank you very much to all of our presenters, Mark, Patrice, and Bradley, for their presentations and their time, their efforts, their all their work. And on behalf of the program committee, thank you very much for coming and being an important part of the conference this year. And thank you for all of our great questions. So we'll stop the recording and we'll finish up there, but thank you so much, and enjoy the last little bit of the conference.